taking part of the SaaStock segment with the launch of SaaStock Local here in Copenhagen. And we have a really fantastic panel here with us today. We're going to focus on landing, expanding, and growth at scale, and really all of the challenges, factors, things you need to think about to ensure that you do that successfully. So I'm just going to take a minute to allow each of our speakers to just introduce themselves. So let's start from the end. We have Aaron Ross, who's the author of Predictable Revenue and Impossible to Inevitable. Welcome, Aaron.
Yep, thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Great stuff. Seth Pierrepont from Accel.
Hi, everybody.
Hanno Renner from Personio.
Hi.
And we have Ulrik from Falcon, who's exited in the last year.
Yeah, nice to meet you all. Happy to share some stories and anecdotes.
Great stuff. So each of our speakers have got a really unique insight on the specifics of scaling and you know what that really takes. We're going to start with Aaron, and we're just going to look at the kind of foundation of what you need to do to put a really good sales process in place. Aaron, what would you say are the kind of processes that you need to get right in the early days if you have that long-term vision to scale and expand?
Sure. Well, let me start with the simplest one that I still think people don't do enough of. In fact, we were just chatting with Ulrik about this, is specialize your salespeople. So as soon as you have 2 salespeople, so metaphor is, I don't know any sports teams where the coach says, all right, everybody go out and attack and defend. Right? That doesn't make any sense, but that's what we do with sales, which is everybody prospect and close and manage customers.
Yep.
And it's just too much. So the simplest thing you can do if you have salespeople that'll make the biggest difference and make everything else easier is specialize them. So you have prospectors who prospect, closers who close new customers. If you have leads from marketing, sort of a different role for responding to marketing leads, and other teams for managing current customers. Like that makes everything else easier. That will enable faster scaling of the team when it's working. Like they can do fewer things better. So I say it's like growing that kind of team too, it's more like Lego blocks. It makes hiring easier, it makes ramp faster, it makes training easier, it just basically makes everything better.
Great.
And it doesn't happen enough still.
So getting that right in the early stage to really enable you.
If you have 2 people, you usually have a junior salesperson and a closer. If you have 1 person, you have to they use calendaring and they have to focus their time in certain ways. So it's really about focusing on doing fewer things better.
Ulrik, I know that this was quite important for you in Falcon. Can you talk about how you addressed this and put that theory into practice with your inside sales team?
Yeah, so just for a bit of context, so we were founded kind of really bootstrapped in 2010, raised our first seed round in the summer of 12, and there and then I realized I had to build an inside sales team. So we had our first head of sales hired in the summer of 12. Him and I hired 4 sales guys, and we went off, let's do selling. And that was a fantastic success, and we were really very intrigued about the product market fit we had and how well inside sales worked. Then we were 2 quarters in, and things were pretty magical, but then I started seeing, also had doubled the sales team very quickly, even after 2 quarters, having raised very little funds. So we got something right, but then I realized that reps were either had a fat pipeline that they were trying to close, or they were trying to prospect and had nothing really in forecast. And so this is less novel today, but in 2012 in Copenhagen it certainly was. And then a guy recommended me Aaron's book. I remember getting it on my Kindle app on the taxi home from the event, and I read all through the night and came in the morning and said, we got to do this. And I looked dreary-eyed, like, oh my God, the boss has read a book. And I was
again.
And I was like, we got to do this, and we just separated the sales roles, and it allowed us to raise a Series C on a much more a Series A on a much more structured basis in how we were running the sales team. But I think these pieces of advice has a ton to do with a couple of things. Where are you in your journey? At which scale? And also, what's your ACV? Because I think a lot of what Aaron is talking about, at least in his first book, and what I'm talking about is an ACV, an annual contract value of a certain number.
At least a few $1,000s.
Yeah, I mean, you need a certain ACV to have a very kind of these guys generate the leads, and we get this for marketing, and then these guys prospect, and these guys close. We need a certain contract value to be able to do that. And the larger the contract value, the more sophisticated you can get. I think that's important to
great to hear how you were able to implement some of Aaron's kind of theory and practice there. How about yourself, Hanno? At Personio, you've grown over the last 3 years to about 270 people now, and I understand in the last year you've embarked on having a kind of outbound sales operation. What's that experience been like for you, and how do you think about that with a vision to expand internationally as well?
Yeah, I think what Ulrik said makes a ton of sense in the beginning. Like, you got to get that first movement going. For us, we were lucky that we had quite some inbound traffic from our first customer. We also bootstrapped in the beginning, and then they were referring customers to new leads, and then we had that inbound. Then we started doing quite some marketing, and then sort of with the, as mentioned, lower contract values, that was really effective for us to scale quite effectively and quite fast. However, that at some point you realize, one, you want to have keep driving up your RPAs. At the same time, you also want to make it much more predictable, not just being hustling. And I think you can hustle to 5 million, you can hustle to 10 million ARR, but at a certain point, you need to have that kind of predictability. And then when we sort of were raising a bigger round at the beginning of this year, we needed to also have something to prove for and something to talk about how we're going to put that money to work, and not just because in B2B you often run out of ways to deploy capital at Google AdWords and these kind of things, because there's just not as much search traffic as if you're selling sweaters or whatever. And therefore, we built up an outbound motion in the beginning of this year, ramped that up to now 15 prospecting rep by now, and I think the last month 40% of our revenue came from that outbound engine, and it's really nice to see how it complements each other as we're still continuing to keep and ramp the inbound, and that also supports the overall go-to-market motion, but then with the outbound being much more able to target and focus on our core segment and decide on which customers we want to have, that again then help us drive our ARPA.
What's nice about this is that we have quite a balanced perspective from each of you on the panel, and I wanted to just take a moment to ask Seth, what's your perspective from the VC side of things? When you're talking with early stage SaaS businesses, how do you assess whether they have the kind of sales operation that can scale and really grow internationally?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think just for context, so we tend to focus on Series A, and so what that typically means in terms of maturity of a company is that there is certainly an element of product market fit, and that they've started to test their go-to-market strategy, not totally ironed out. They're not sort of abiding by the necessarily the 6 C's of cloud metrics, but they're still really starting to work through how to go to market. And so for us, we're trying to be as analytical as we can when we're looking at data. We encourage the companies that we're backing to measure everything, kind of building on Aaron's point. It's not just putting this structure in place, but also just ensuring that you know exactly what each of those functions is doing, and starting to measure both the inputs and the outputs as early as possible. And so for us, when we feel like a company is really ready to absorb a large chunk of capital and step on the gas, some of these metrics are starting to fall in place. We see buying patterns from the customers and repeatable patterns from the sales executives. Great.
So I think that's a really good point to start with the sales kind of operation, considering that very much from the early days for product-based businesses. As you have a bit of an insight on each of our panel members, we're using Slido, so feel free to add some questions there for us, and we'll address them as we continue through the panel now. But I'd just like to move on to product. Ulrik, let's start with you, and we'll move back towards the other side of the panel. But I wanted to ask, in your days at Falcon.io, how did you adapt the product at scale? So as you expand into new markets, did you struggle with ensuring you maintained a strong product market fit for your customers?
Yeah, definitely. So I think product market fit in the very early days, and even the inception of a product, is often founder-led. And you have all these things, these heuristics you pick up, and then you envision a product, and hopefully that's about right, and you get more signals. And I think the big thing is you need to transition from this founder-led product market fit guidance to something that is completely systemic and coming from your sales organization and all your frontline staff. And we've obsessed over that as well. And I think our category has been, so we're in social media management. It's probably one of the most hyper-competitive categories in SaaS there probably was. There's a lot of the big guys, the middle guys, which we were, and then a ton of the small guys. And I think a big part of our success and why we ended up, I would say, winning Europe and becoming one of the leading players, kind of gunning for the top end of pole position globally and where this category is going, is because we completely obsessed over all of these things and trying to make everything systemic. So we think a lot about the org as and all the processes as a machine that needs to collate and then build the roadmap, frankly. So our roadmap right now is so many signals that's being funneled into, I think product management in our shop is probably one of the most one of the roles with the most cognitive load to try and figure out all these things that's going on. And we're in the mid-market, which we cannot just look at, here's a big ticket enterprise customer that wants something, and then we go off and build that and generate additional revenue. We kind of need to do something that works at scale in a one-size-fits-most way. So you've got to go from product market fit, kind of led by a founder vision, to something that becomes systemic. And that journey is not easy. It requires a ton of good staff that you need to go out and find that takes over the custodian of the product market fit, you might say.
Do you move from that kind of founder systemic vision as you expand to empowering product managers with the responsibility to kind of prioritize the evolution of the product?
Yes, you do. And you have an entire structure, an org which is product with layers and everything, right? And then it doesn't mean that the founder kind of goes away and just becomes a board member, but you need to kind of drop in at certain points in time. You need to remind people of where the North Star is. But as you get to scale, if you're a 40 million ARR company, then you have a $40 million obligation to an existing subscription base, and that really drives a ton of what you should be doing, rather than whatever I would think is fun tomorrow, right? So that's really just how it goes.
And how about yourself, Hanno? Because you're 3 years in and now internationally scaling, and whilst you have HR, which is kind of different in different international markets, do you find that you have a lot of adaptation to make to the product to fit as you go into those?
Yeah, so there's two sides to our product, I think, where it's a bit different to look at. We have an HR core, HR management recruiting system, where again within that product or platform we're building, there's different layers and different requirements for customer for localization. For recruiting, for example, there's very little except from adapting to the different job boards in different regions when we come to Nordics and so on. However, in some of the other areas like time and attendance, that's much more localized already. However, on the other hand, we also have a payroll product, and that, of course, is 100% has to be localized. And while we build a sort of a mid layer that enables us this fast, rapid localization into the markets, we then have to build an engine for each of the markets. And there we also can't just sell the German engine for the Nordics and say, okay, Danes, we don't have your payroll engine, but let's use Germany. So that's very different, of course. And there we have to completely adapt the product. I think what's on the sort of the first part I mentioned within HR, where it's a bit more sort of, I think, gray areas, is where you have to be careful to not stall yourself in internationalization and say, now we're sort of doing a market analysis and now we found out all these things and then we're building all these things into the product before we can even start selling, because that's the same way we started in Germany. We weren't ready for the German market. We just learned a lot along the way. And therefore, you don't want to also give your then country managers and head of sales for the different regions the excuse of like, of course, the product isn't localized, because it was the same for our core market a couple of years back. But then you have to be open for learning from them and making sure that you have the right process in place to make sure that you learn really what are the biggest blockers and how can you then put them into your overall roadmap. Whereas as we're just hearing, if you have a big subscription base in your core market, you can't just say, now we're not building anything for them anymore. And therefore, I think building that in and balancing it well, that you have a nice like international stream is important, but not too early, just trying to build everything you can for that market, which then for other reasons might be either the wrong things or you might not even be successful in the market anyway.
Yeah. I understand that as you've been adapting with kind of product evolution, you've also gone through a process of changing your pricing structure, or at least looking at how to adjust pricing. Can you talk us through a bit about the challenges there, especially internationally as you expand?
Yeah, I think it was actually a very exciting project. I wouldn't realize, like, pricing for a lot of people, including myself, didn't sound like something that's really, I don't know, very exciting to spend a lot of time about and really thinking through. But we always had a bit of a challenge that we had, and I think a lot of sort of the SME vendors have that you have these companies that feel you're really cheap because they compare you with a Workday and these kind of players, and then you have companies that feel you're really expensive because you don't have a solution in place for the problem you're solving yet. And we were exactly at that point where we always were sort of in a limbo state with our pricing, and we've put quite some effort into analyzing that and realizing that with the breadth of the product we're offering, we can package that a lot smarter than we've done so far in order to capture more of that willingness to pay and allow those companies that think you're expensive to start with a smaller package at a lower price, but at the same time the ones that want to buy the Mercedes or Porsche or whatever, like kind of the full-blown product, those ones you can offer that at a higher price if they have the willingness to pay. And that the same way also goes when you go beyond your core market where you already have that spread. Of course, it goes even bigger because you have different markets where you go to Switzerland and people feel like as long as they pay in euro, everything is crazily cheap anyway. And then you go maybe to Spain where they're not as used to paying for software because they want to use free products. And that sort of differentiation of your pricing and that ability to capture that willingness to pay really allows you to really capture more and an easier way, and without your salespeople just discounting away your product, and that has been very impactful to our growth as well.
It's great. It's great to see the factors that relate to the product as you expand into new markets. Seth, I want to move this on to your perspective on, when you're investing in Series A SaaS, B2B SaaS businesses, and you see them going through these challenges of expansion and internationalization. How do you assess the best places to invest revenue, for these companies as they expand to make sure that they actually achieve their growth results?
In terms of geography, or in terms of
where in terms of geography, particularly expanding into new countries.
I think it's very company by company dependent, and depends on the type of product you're selling. I think for a company like Personio, it makes sense to expand into other European geographies. It's hyper fragmented, payroll's hyper fragmented, HR's hyper fragmented across Europe. I'd say by and large, though, most of our software companies that we're investing in are moving to the US. So I think for every dollar spent on software, 50 cents is spent in the US. So it's just a huge, huge, huge market. And also those dollars are valued more highly depending on the type of, again, software category. So for us, most of the European software companies that we're investing in, they build their technology and product teams in Europe, and that's actually an advantage to them because they're not really competing on talent with other well-funded companies in the Valley or in other places in the US. And then they build out that commercial muscle overseas. And so we typically intersect them on that journey. So they typically have one or two people that are starting to expand the go-to-market function in the US. And so that's what we are most helpful with.
Do you think that happens because naturally you're looking for portfolio companies that have a vision or potential to expand into the US, or because you're based there as a firm kind of historically?
Yeah, I mean, we have a big presence in Europe and Asia as well, in addition to the US. So I think, it really, again, it's a hard question to provide a general answer for. I think we have another company in our portfolio called Payfit, which is in the payroll space that is just focused on the European markets. We have another company that is providing a booking product to GPs in Europe, and that's big in France and now Germany. So, clearly there are lots of products that are geared for local markets, in which case you can have really big companies built in Europe. But I'd say, by and large, if I look across our portfolio, most of them are geared up to address the US market.
Yeah, sure, Ulrik.
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons that happened to us that we wanted to go to the US pretty early and got a ton of VC support to do it is also that the exit revenue multiples for somebody that is at least semi-successful or can indicate success in the US is just a lot bigger, right? So we exited in January this year to a US public company called Cision. And if we had not built our go-to-market function and had a lot of success in the US, even though nascent and there were competitors in the US that were there, I think it would have probably been a different outcome, because we would just be the European guys who hadn't really shown that we were able to compete in the major league, right? So, and I was very focused on that myself, and I think a lot of our shareholders, the 4 VCs we had, also had that valuation, that revenue multiple thing about it, right? So for good reasons.
So it helps to have that vision already embedded in the company. Please keep sharing your questions on Slido. If somebody's controlling the monitors, I can't see the questions on this screen on this side, so maybe we can get those on this screen. But whilst we're doing that, I wanted to look at correcting course, because as B2B SaaS companies expand typically beyond Series A and they're operating in new markets, of course there are many challenges that come up, and you have to correct course quite often. I'm going to stay with you, Seth, for now on this one. What are the common practices and processes you have for helping SaaS companies correct course if they look to grow into a new market and they find challenges there that they weren't particularly expecting?
I mean,
I imagine this is case by case too, but
yeah.
But are there any general kind of challenges you come across?
I mean, I think the one universal truth is that building companies is really, really hard, and it's inevitable that you'll run into challenges along the way. And so we just try and provide, shortcuts to spotting those challenges and addressing them quickly by, either introductions to other folks in our portfolio that are, have successfully scaled through this, part of their journey and might be in this overlapping category. Also as VCs, Accel's been in business for 35 years, so we've seen, lots of these movies through lots of tech cycles, and so just the partners around the table have, are able to provide, hopefully useful tips and tricks to getting through those difficult times. But, I think that is one certainty in company building, is that there are going to be, mistakes made along the way, and that's, it's part of the game. Yeah,
part of it, expecting them and preempting, if you can, these challenges and how you might address them when you come up. Maybe looking for the information before you need it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we kind of alluded to it earlier, but I think being as data-driven as we can, especially on the commercial side of things, really allows you to diagnose these problems as early as possible. And kind of being, very detailed in those analytics. So I kind of alluded to inputs and outputs. Like, you could have sales guys that are just, you could have a sales guy that knocks it out of the park one quarter, like, has 150% of quota, and you can say, wow, this guy's awesome. And then you sort of look at the inputs, and he's like, well, he just had one lucky lead that allowed him to knock it out of the park. And then all of a sudden, that's sort of a false positive that you don't want to necessarily replicate. So I think it's just being hyper analytical about, especially in the go-to-market side of things, what are those inputs, what are those outputs, and ensuring that you have something that's highly repeatable.
Great. Aaron, how about the sales operation processes that you set up in the early days? When companies are expanding, how do they maintain that effective sales strategy, that operation as they're getting bigger and as they're coming across new challenges in different markets?
Yeah, well, I'm going to build on what Seth said, because I think the best thing you can do as early as you can is try to get a picture of how the different pieces of your sales and marketing, or let's just say lead generation and sales, are working. So when you have, like, one of the biggest reasons companies plateau is because they see their lead generation trends growing, but they don't understand why. And so when they hit a lead generation plateau, they're like, we had all these inbound leads coming and they were growing and growing, and then they just stopped. Like, what happened? Okay, well, inbound leads can plateau. And there's also this chasm where what you find is in the early days, getting to your first 1 or 2 or maybe 5 or 10 million, a lot of your leads are coming through word of mouth and relationship-based. Those plateau. So if you don't understand, for example, this is this whole idea of how to nail a niche from the Impossible book. It's that those early days of relationship-driven leads, the plateau, and the next type of leads, paid lead generation, whether it's through marketing or whether through outbound, is much harder to do. You can't just start it you have to give yourself like 6 or 12 months to start paid lead generation to be able to continue that growth once the relationship-driven leads go like this and flat, and so you need to start early on the paid in order to keep the growth going. That's a really common misunderstanding, is how much harder outbound marketing, outbound sales are. But what you could do is when you really are measuring kind of your different lead generation funnels, like here's our customer success, here's our marketing, here's our outbound sales, and you have those measured differently, different types of leads, if everyone seeds, nets, and spears people. And when you are more discerning about the types of leads you're generating, you can catch problems earlier. So again, what Seth said is basically, if you see sales dip, you're already too late. What you want to see is when lead generation dips, then you have time to fix that before sale. It's a leading indicator before sales dips. So the more discerning you can be about where leads are coming from and how each operation of sales is working, prospecting, inbound response, closing, account management, it gives you more foresight ahead of time to possible problems earlier. So a stitch in time saves 9. It's like, and again, it's challenging. And I'll admit, it's hard to get like accurate metrics in dashboards around each of these little functions. It takes a lot of like detailed evolution, a lot of trial and error. Like to get even a new dashboard together and get it working the way you want can be at least weeks, if not months.
I think Hanno had a point on this as well. Do you want to share an experience?
So makes a ton of sense, and that's 100% true what Aaron just said. One thing, like for us, it was like we were lucky, I think, in a way that we sometimes had started these next waves already before the other one plateaued or stopped. And only now looking back, I'm like, whew, like good on us that we managed that somehow, but it was not as strategic. So you should definitely think about that and watch them grow. I think the one thing to add to it maybe is that for us in the early days, having these like continuing to growth rates, even if you're tripling revenue year on year or in the beginning even higher rates, is quite easy while it's so low numbers. But once you get to sort of, you don't triple from 3 to 9 million anymore, but you want to triple from 10 to 30 or 15 to 45 or double or whatever, like the absolute numbers get just a lot bigger. And then it's easy to just build that in your revenue model, and you just pull that across, and then you have a bunch of links in your Excel sheet, and then it just spits out a number of sales reps, and they all do the same. But typically a lot of channels and then things you do don't scale just exactly like your Excel model does when you pull the cells across. And therefore I think it's, it's surprising, but fortunately it isn't. And therefore I think it's important that as you really sort of feel that you have the base engine running, that you also think about what are the additional levers that can provide you the extra 5 or 10 million ARR that help you get from sort of 10 to X million revenue as you get a bit bigger. And I think things like adding new product lines for us, it was certainly the payroll thing that has a big impact now on growth, but also pricing or new markets or things that just really add on top to your regular growth are really important and really sort of important.
Yeah, let me just chime in one more thing on that. I think companies wait too long, for example, to put in a customer success function or account management. And the difference is customer success, and there's lots of ways to do these. These are teams dedicated to ensuring that your customers get value from your product or service, is one. And to the right kinds of customers that you can cross-sell and upsell. And companies tend to be too focused on new business, where they need to balance out new business versus their investment in making sure their customers are happy and are staying and cross-selling, upselling. People wait too long to really focus on the back end of their sales cycle and customers.
Totally.
Great. So we're getting pretty near to the end, and just before we wrap up, I'd love to touch on maintaining a strong culture as you expand as well. Aaron, can you touch on how that evolves for a sales team, ensuring that culture stays strong within the sales team as you're growing and facing the challenges?
I don't know how to maintain a culture that way, but I will say the thing that a value I would emphasize that's so important in sales, it's like coachability. Like hiring for people who are coachable. Now, like if you're a tiny team, but the world in sales is people need to be able to adapt. And I can't remember who told me today, but they were just saying that they were having trouble hiring salespeople because all the salespeople who had experience were like stuck in their habits. So you have to be really focused. Yes, people who can sell, but even more important, that are coachable, open to new ideas, and willing to try things. Like that's just an incredibly important. I think that's the #1 value that HubSpot hires for in sales, or at least used to. So, and of course, salespeople who really want to do right by the customer, right? They need to make money, but what you don't want are salespeople who are so committed to selling that they're going to bend the rules or get into gray areas around, honesty, expectations, not telling people everything. But you really need to be honest.
Great. Okay, well, we had a problem with viewing the questions, and now I can see them. So I'm just going to take the most popular one. How did you settle on a price on your products? Which process did you go through? I'd love to focus on Ulrik and Hanno for this question, if you can both share your processes before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think for the longest time, we had a very unsophisticated view on, or really unsophisticated process. So we started here in Copenhagen, and then we hired that first small nascent sales team, which was a German guy, a Portuguese guy, and a Dutch guy, which is like we tested everything at once, which you shouldn't be doing. And it turned out to be very, very successful. And when we were selling into the European market and the Euro market, especially in Germany, it was like, how about the same number and put a Euro sign after it instead of, so that's a 7x on the price point. And it was really early, and this was, again, an inside sales prospect, an outbound engine. So we had very little inbound. We had no public pricing. And I think that's probably one of the more fortunate things for us, because it was very, very difficult for us to figure out what the right price point was. We were able to have a conversation with the market in all of our interactions and figure out what that was. And then we ended up at an ASP that's been very stable, a little bit different from market to market. And the way we landed at that was to give the salesperson within reasonable bounds, some discounting ability, and we landed on what that was. We're also in a market where we had competitors, so it was not our decision all alone, right? But it was never very methodical. Let's put on our thinking hats and go into a room, and we came out with this wonderful thing. It was a line that kind of asymptotically went towards something, and it's stabilized.
Pricing's a pain in the ass.
Yep.
Yeah. On that note, I think we're going to have to wrap up. So I'd like to thank all of our panel speakers.
You're welcome.
That was a good ending. And thanks for joining us.
Got it.
Thank you.